Okay, so welcome to New Perspectives, an Integral Yoga platform sponsored by our university in Surat, India, and sister organizations, Sri Aurobindo Integral Life Center in Surat, as well as here in Fountain Inn, South Carolina. Through collaborative efforts such as New Perspectives, it is the hope of these kindred organizations to assist in building a bridge between East and West. All three organizations are founded by H.P. Rama, who is with us here today. Welcome, H.P. I'm Radhe, the Executive Director of Sri Aurobindo Integral Life Center in Fountain Inn, and I am joined by my colleague, Dr. Vladimir Yatsenko, moderator of today's webinar. We are also joined by Dr. Kiran Singh, Dean of Humanities at Aarau University. Today's New Perspective topic is on the psychic being and its evolution and role in integral yoga. When addressing the 3 steps of spiritual knowledge of the self, Sri Aurobindo says, the first step is the discovery of the soul, the secret psychic entity, the divine element within us. When that becomes dominant over the nature, when we are consciously the soul, and when mind, life, and body take their true place as its instruments, we are aware of a guide within that knows the truth, the good, the true delight, and beauty of existence. A guide within that controls heart and intellect by its luminous law and leads our life and being towards spiritual completeness. This is the first step of self-realization, to enthrone the soul, the divine psychic individual, in the place of the ego. Today, we are honored to have with us Dr. Brant Courtright, who will speak on the topic, the opening of the heart and the evolution of the psychic being. Welcome, Dr. Courtright. We're very much looking forward to your talk on such an important topic today. And at this time, Dr. Vladimir Yatsenko will formally introduce our speaker, Dr. Courtright, and open our New Perspectives Forum. Vladimir?
Thank you, Radhe. Right, we are very happy to have with us Dr. Brant Courtright, who is the professor of emeritus with the California Institute of Integral Studies and a licensed clinical psychologist with a private practice in San Francisco, focused on brain health, anxiety, and depression. He is the author of Integral Psychology, Yoga, Growth, and Opening the Heart, as well as Psychotherapy and Spirit. And his most recent book, which is the Amazon's bestseller, Holistic Healing for Anxiety, Depression, and Cognitive Decline. Today's topic is opening the heart and the evolution of the psychic being. Sri Aurobindo's Integral Yoga puts the evolution of consciousness at the heart of this manifest universe. The psychic being is the evolutionary element within us, which develops progressively, lifetime after lifetime, toward greater consciousness, love, peace, light, joy, and union with the divine. Its location on the inner plane is behind the heart chakra, and the opening of the heart is essential to the awakening and coming forward of our evolving soul, our spiritual individuality. So without further ado, I invite Brant to address the audience. Please, Brant.
Thank you, Vladimir, and everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you all, talking about the most important thing in the world, which is our soul. So I'd like to start by just putting this into the spiritual context of integral yoga. So what Sri Aurobindo did was really to synthesize, to integrate the various streams of spirituality in India and the world. And I think we can talk about 2 major streams of spirituality in the world. the stream of the personal divine and the stream of the impersonal divine, right? The impersonal divine traditions, such as Buddhism, Taoism, Advaita, talk about the divine as this vast impersonal consciousness, pure being, Satchitananda. And our fundamental identity is one with that, the Atman that is Brahman. Much of the East has been influenced by this tradition of the impersonal divine. Much of the West, on the other hand, has been influenced by traditions of the personal divine. Christianity, Judaism, Islam, as well as the Bhakti traditions of India, talk about the divine not just as pure being, but as a being, imaged in the West mostly in masculine terms, but in the East imaged as male and female at the same time, but nevertheless as a very personal being. And our fundamental identity in the non-dual traditions of this is the soul. Our soul is a portion of this divine being. So there's a kind of competition for which view of spirituality is more ultimately real, right? The traditions of the personal divine tend to put down traditions of the impersonal divine, right? That the impersonal is Krishna's inmost aura, but not the essence of Krishna himself. Similarly, the traditions of the impersonal divine see the personal as kind of just the last step before the ultimate reality. And what I appreciate, one of the many things I appreciate about Sri Aurobindo, is that he puts these two traditions together as co-equal. The divine is both personal and impersonal, equally. That's, I think, a profound integration. And of course, it comes out of his own experience, right? His first major realization with Lele was of the impersonal, right? Nirvana, the Atman. And then a year or two later, in jail, he had the realization of the personal divine, seeing the jail, the prisoners, everything as Krishna, the non-dual personal divine. So these two aspects of ultimate reality of the divine are reflected in us, in our central being. So we have both the Atman and a soul, an evolving soul. So the Atman is one with Brahman and impersonal, right? It's a vast, egoless witness to everything. Vast peace, vast bliss, and non-evolving. The Atman at the beginning of evolution is the same as the Atman at the end of evolution. It's above and it presides over the evolution impartially. So its native home is above, but it exists on every plane. It's the foundation, the most foundational consciousness. So although its native home is above in the overhead planes, rising into higher and higher frequency, it also exists on this plane. Ramana Maharshi experienced it in the heart. Other people experience it in different places. For Sri Aurobindo, this divine status of the divine, the Atman, also raises into higher and higher levels of completeness and integrality, right? That in Aurobindo's view, there's the higher mind, where the self is completely unveiled, the Atman is unveiled. But then there are these higher statuses of divine consciousness, right? The mind of light, right? Where consciousness is no longer by thought, but by light. And then we have the intuitive mind, the overmind, and finally the supermind, the supramental. Now, in Sri Aurobindo's view, consciousness evolution is at the very center of all this. What Sri Aurobindo did was he took these world traditions and these traditions within Vedanta, and he united them and he put them into an evolutionary context. So that the divine, Brahman, first of all, involved itself to create this universe, right? The Big Bang, 14 billion years ago. The most dense form of consciousness is the physical, this material world. And after billions of years, consciousness, which looks like it's absent from the material, but actually the material is secretly conscious, right? It's in a kind of sleep or a swoon. It slowly begins to unfold, to evolve. And so we get life, we get unicellular organisms, we get plants. And then over millions of years, the next evolutionary stage emerges, which is mind. In animals, we get the beginnings of mind. But in animals, mind is imprisoned by the senses. It's not until the human level where we get language, where mind comes into its own. Mind can step back from the senses, reflect, observe what is happening. And now the stage is set for the next emerging stage of consciousness, which is spirit taking possession of this instrument, this body, heart, mind, instrumental nature. And the soul, the evolving soul, or what Sri Aurobindo calls the psychic being, is what evolves lifetime after lifetime. So the word soul is a kind of a funny word. Sri Aurobindo mostly uses soul and psychic being interchangeably. Probably 98% of the time, he uses them interchangeably. Technically, there's a slight difference. Technically, the psychic being is that evolving portion of the soul. The soul has all possibilities, but evolves out of it, very particular ones, to create our unique spiritual individuality, our unique psychic being, our unique soul. And this soul develops from just a kind of whisper, just a kind of small presence. And it begins as this spark, which then becomes a flame, lifetime after lifetime. So the idea is that the first task of the psychic being, of the soul, is to develop the instrumental nature, right? So this spark begins with unicellular organisms. It develops more into plants. In plants, we get an actual psychic presence. Then in animals, we see a more evolved soul, a more evolved psychic being that has more possibilities for self-expression, more capacities. And then the human being, we get really the psychic being. It develops not just from a presence, but into an actual being. What's interesting is that sometimes animals seem like they have more of this than human beings. And I think that the way that's often talked about is that the soul in animals is right in front. There's no ego there, sort of covering it up. So the soul is right there. And in human beings, as we develop, as we are born, the senses pull us outward. And so we begin to identify with this outer consciousness, this outer body, right? And we begin to look for love from our mother, from our father. We begin to be attached to love. We begin to attach to mother's milk. We begin to become attached to eating, to moving our bodies. And slowly an ego develops that organizes all of this. And as this ego develops, we identify more and more with this, and the soul begins to fade more and more into the background. So The essence of the psychic being or the soul is this state of peace, this deep bliss, this joy, this sense of knowing the spiritual right and wrong of things. Sense of love for all creation, for the divine and all creation. A sense of gratitude, harmony, cheerfulness, sweetness, light. It's this luminous center which is located behind the heart chakra, on an inner plane, behind the heart chakra. And at first, the soul's task is building up this outer nature, body, heart, mind. But as that happens, then the task is to turn the being within towards the divine. So the psychic being begins to refine the outer nature, right? That the first X number of incarnations, say on the human level, the soul is simply lost in outwardness. We see this in most of humanity, right? Lost in outwardness, lost in this identification with this surface being. But as the psychic being grows, as it gets stronger, as it gets more developed, more individuated, more differentiated, it begins to refine the outer nature and to begin to turn us within. We begin to see that there is a whole consciousness, a whole life inside that we didn't see at first. And this development of the soul is what turns us towards the spiritual life in Sri Aurobindo's view. It's the secret part of us that turns us inward. So we've got these two aspects of our central being. Sometimes Sri Aurobindo talks about the central being as the Atman, sometimes as the psychic being, but most often as both together. We have this impersonal, universal, non-evolving Atman consciousness, and we have this very individuated psychic being. They are both part of us. We have both personal and impersonal within us. The psychic being relates more to the personal divine. The Atman is one with the impersonal divine. Now, Sri Aurobindo is quite wonderful in saying that each person on the spiritual path needs to pick their own way of approaching the divine. You can approach through the impersonal, you can approach through the personal. See which way is natural to you. But he thought that for the majority of people, approaching through the psychic being, through the soul, was the natural way to approach. That it was more accessible, right? The number of people who actually reach enlightenment, not very many. Maybe there's, a dozen in the world. There's a lot of people who talk about it. I understand that. And in the spiritual marketplace, there's a lot of would-be gurus. And I'm a little cynical just because I've come into contact with many of these, and it just seems, the ego just seems all over the place. But you can talk a non-dual game pretty easily for me. It's not so hard to do. But the number of actually enlightened people seems to be pretty small. So the psychic being, on the other hand, is much more accessible, according to Sri Aurobindo, and the mother. The psychic being is our true guide in life because it comes from the divine, because it is part of the divine. It knows the spiritual right and wrong. It knows our pathway in life. And it communicates through a kind of essential feeling, not so much by thought, but by feeling, an essential spiritual feeling, warning us when we are heading off the path by a sense of unease. And when we are on the path, there's a sense of, yes, yes. Now, the tricky part, it seems like, is discerning the ego's vital desire from the soul's aspiration to the divine. So the soul is always in a state of aspiration, right? Aspiration for Sri Aurobindo is what the soul's journey is all about. The soul is always aspiring for the divine and all things divine. The soul is aspiring for union with the divine, for love, for bliss, for peace. It's always in the state of aspiration, wanting to progress, right? The mother says that the essence of the psychic being is constant progress, constant growth. So, this aspiration for constant growth gets mistranslated by the ego as desire. And so, I desire this, I desire that, I desire the other thing. And so, part of what integral yoga attempts to do is this transmuting of desire, ego desire, into aspiration, right? That there are two motivational systems going on. There's ego desire and there's the soul's desire, right? The soul aspires, the ego desires. So aspiration and desire are these two motivational systems. And our task is to begin to navigate more and more the soul's direction. The more we listen to the soul, the more we pay attention to this feeling of unease or this feeling of, yes, moving forward, the louder that voice grows. So the soul begins as this unconscious influence on the person's life. Then, as it gets stronger and stronger, it begins to be a conscious influence. And then there begins to be actually an actual awareness of it. There begins to be some realization of it. And then it begins to come forward, right? So there's these three states Aurobindo makes a differentiation between: experience, realization, and transformation. Experience is temporary. Probably most of us here have had some experience of the divine or of our inner being, soul or Atman. But it's been temporary, right? Experience comes and goes. It enriches the consciousness. It moves us forward, but it's temporary. Realization is where this becomes permanent, a permanent part of the consciousness. And then transformation is where this begins to influence the whole outer being. It begins to infuse this outer nature. So in the psychic awakening, there is this point in the journey where the soul's guidance becomes more and more conscious, and then at a certain point, the soul opens or it awakens. And there is a realization of it. It becomes something we can simply turn to, and it's there. But it starts out very, very far back, very, very far deep inside. And then the process is bringing the psychic being forward so that it begins to infuse our outer life. In Christianity, this is called infused spirituality, where the soul begins to more and more influence the outer being, to sort of raise the vibration of the outer being. Now, the reason that the psychic being is so central in integral yoga is that it is the means of transformation. That simply the realization of the Atman doesn't change the outer nature. The Atman can open to the highest regions of the supramental, but it doesn't have a hold on the body. But the soul is connected to the body. The soul is what brings down the highest, the supramental, into the body and brings about a transformation of the body, because this is fundamentally a physical transformation in the end. So this process of bringing it forward is the process of sadhana, this process of awakening it, and this process then of bringing it forward. And this process of bringing it forward seems like it's a multi-lifetime process for most people. Not everybody, but for most people. There are many people I'm aware of at the ashram and at Oroville who clearly have had a psychic awakening. But the bringing of it fully forward is something that I don't think anybody claims. So the psychic being in people goes through also a kind of developmental process over lifetimes, but also within this lifetime. So there's both an inner and an outer, a within this lifetime and over multiple lifetimes developmental process that happens. So when the baby is born, my sense is that the soul, the psychic being, is right there on the surface. When I was present for the birth of my 2 children, it felt like it was this very sacred moment when the birth process happened, where there was this blast of loving light energy as this being came forth. And this little teeny being, it seemed like it changed actually everybody in the birth room, right? The doctors, the nurses, everybody. I mean, birth units in hospitals, I think, are very different than other parts of the hospitals. There's a different consciousness there, in my experience anyway. And this little being who has no means to express itself had this powerful, loving, blissful energy. My heart was just blasted open. And I felt like I finally understood the Christmas story, right? The birth of Christ. It was like peace on earth, goodwill to all. It was just a sacred moment. And this little being, it seemed like there was this vast consciousness, but no way to express itself. Couldn't even hold its head. So it starts out maybe very close to the surface, but then it begins to go further in as the mind begins to develop. I think the ages of 3 and 4 are particularly sweet because the psychic being is very close to the surface. The heart is very, very open. They are still kind of tripped out just looking at the world. It's a pretty sweet time. Then around 7, according to the mother, something else happens. The psychic being begins to go further and further within. And this corresponds to with what Piaget called, I think, concrete operations, where the mind begins to be more and more abstract. And as this happens over the next few years, the psychic being retreats further and further inside as the mind more and more takes over the central control. And then when puberty hits, the hormones kick in. It's like, bye-bye, psychic being. And then when we reach adulthood, of course, and we have a developed mind, we have a developed vital or emotional being, a developed physical being, the task then becomes to go inside and begin to reconnect to this. Begin to really bring this deeper soul forward. And in that process, I think that the opening of the heart is crucial, right? Because what happens as we grow up is that we are also wounded, right? One thing that modern psychology has discovered is that everybody grows up wounded. Nobody grows up with a perfect childhood. There are hurts, there are traumas, there are big T traumas, there are little t traumas. One of the ways I have tried to make Sri Aurobindo's teachings alive and relevant to the present world is to try to link his teachings to present day knowledge. And so my book, Integral Psychology, Yoga, Growth, and Opening the Heart, really tries to locate Western psychology within the context of integral yoga, right? To really situate what Western psychology has discovered within these greater discoveries of Sri Aurobindo about the inner world. And Western psychology has made a research project of the ego and how the ego develops an unconscious and unconscious defenses, and how it is wounded and how it defends against those wounds by contracting the heart, by hardening the heart, by defending against feelings. So I think that psychotherapy and spiritual practice have a similar goal, which is to open the heart, to increase the heart's capacity for love, for generosity, for appreciation, for connection. But spirituality and psychology go about this in very different ways. Spiritual traditions tend to open the heart directly through bhakti, through love, devotion, surrender. Whereas Western psychology opens the heart by seeing how it's closed and by going into the defensive contractions and unhealed wounds that cover the heart. And as those wounds heal, as we are able to tune into the shadow side, negative feelings, hate, anger, fear, shame, as we are able to own those feelings, the heart then opens. Now, these two different ways of opening the heart actually, I think, are opening two different hearts. Right? Sri Aurobindo talks about two hearts. He says there is this deeper spiritual heart, and on the surface, there is the ordinary heart of emotion. That's what Western psychology studies. Spiritual traditions, on the other hand, focus on this inner heart. And as both hearts open, the soul begins to awaken, begins to come forward. Now, it seems to me that the biggest obstacle to this heart opening is a closed outer heart. And so one thing that I think is helpful is to begin to see the ways in which this outer heart has closed, the ways in which we defend against feelings, the ways in which we ignore feelings. And that's hard to do because our unconscious is not aware of this. And so inner work of some sort, and there's many different varieties of it. Therapy is one, coaching. There's many different pathways here, body work. What happens is that as the person grows up with these neurotic contractions, the heart closes and squeezes, and our capacity for feeling goes way, way down. We have a stunted capacity for feeling. And so through inner work, we begin to re-own this feeling capacity. We begin to see how actually, no, the ego can learn to tolerate higher and higher intensities of feeling and wider kinds of feelings. And as that happens, as our capacity for feeling negative feelings increases, so does our capacity for feeling positive feelings, right? When we shut off the capacity for feeling, we shut off the positive and the negative. It's this whole feeling capacity that gets shut down. As we head into the shadow, into the negative feelings, and own those, heal those wounds, the higher feelings, love, gratitude, appreciation, that begins to open up as well. And our capacity for bhakti, our capacity for devotion increases. So one thing that Western psychology has discovered is that the self needs to be always growing, right? In the same way as the mother talked about the soul being in a state of constant progress, well, the soul also puts forth this body, heart, mind instrument with each new incarnation. And as part of that go certain capacities, certain abilities, certain potentials. So in Essays on the Gita, Sri Aurobindo talks about the importance of our essential nature, svabhava, and being in harmony with our svabhava, with our essential nature, is part of the teaching of the Gita, part of our unfolding in the world, allowing this essential nature to come forth in our work, in our lives. It may not be an exact translation, but I think a rough translation of our essential nature, of our svabhava, would be the authentic self in Western psychology, right? And because of our wounding, the authentic self is stifled with a kind of defensive self on top. It's an amalgam of real authentic self and defensive false self. And as we work through that, and as the authentic self comes more and more online, then the soul has more and more of an instrument through which to work, increasingly consciously as we do sadhana. Now, in the same way that in Western psychology, there is a big focus on the growth of the self. I mean, what therapy really tries to do is to get a person growing on their own, and then therapy stops. The reason people come into therapy is because they're stuck. And when they're stuck, they develop symptoms: depression, anxiety, shame. Ego becomes fragile, becomes fragmentation prone. As the wounds are healed, as the person's growth process gets moving again, then they are in the flow. Then therapy ends. They are growing on their own. Well, it turns out that the same process also works with the brain. And my most recent book really takes integral yoga into the realm of neuroscience and the brain. So the brain also is always growing, always moving. You know, we tend to think of the brain as like a computer, but that's really a very bad image for the brain, because a computer is something dead, right? The brain is not like a computer chip. It's not static like that. It's always in movement. It's more like a big amoeba, this organism that is always moving, always growing. So we've known about neuroplasticity for many years, or actually a couple of decades now, a few decades, where the brain is always making new connections within itself. But in the past 15 years or so, 20 years, they've now discovered that the brain also makes new brain cells, a process called neurogenesis. So they used to think that the brain stopped growing in our early 20s, and then it was just one slow die-off. But now they realize, no, the brain grows throughout our entire lifetime. And it turns out that the rate of neurogenesis and neuroplasticity, also called synaptogenesis, our neurogenic rate has a big impact on how we feel and how we think. So when this neurogenic rate slows down, we get stress, we get anxiety, we get depression, we get cognitive decline. The common underlying neural mechanisms behind these is a neurogenic slowing. And so there's been a big increase, like by 5 to 10 times in the past 50 years, of these disorders of anxiety, of depression, and of cognitive decline, of Alzheimer's, of dementia. It's another pandemic. And one of the main reasons is because of all the neurotoxins in the environment. These neurotoxins, if you go to Wikipedia, you'll see 200 pages of lists of neurotoxins, 30 on each page. There's 6,000 neurotoxins in the environment that were never there before. Some of these we know about, mercury, lead, arsenic. Many are just coming into consciousness now. Different plastics, phthalates. These are endocrine disruptors. Things like smog has a big impact on our neurogenic rate. Pesticides, glyphosate, the most widely used pesticide in the world. 300 million pounds of it in the United States. It's used widely in India, in China, in Brazil. This has a powerful neurogenic slowing. And in America, 93% of Americans have measurable glyphosate levels. So it causes a kind of weakening of the brain. And so when this happens, when the brain weakens, when the neurogenic rate slows, we get all of these symptoms. Again, anxiety, depression, brain fog. And that makes sadhana very difficult to do because we've got all this other stuff. There's all this interference going on the surface. And so my own sense is that an integral approach to sadhana and healing is body, heart, mind, spirit, right? That we need to work on all levels. We need to work on this physical level of the brain. We need to work on this emotional level, healing our wounds and expanding our capacity to feel. We need to work on the mental level, learning new things all the time. And we need to work spiritually, doing some kind of spiritual practice, whether that is bhakti yoga, jnana yoga, whether that is karma yoga, whether that is integral yoga. Hopefully all of these together. Now, I'd like to just end by doing one of the meditation practices that Sri Aurobindo recommends for awakening the psychic being. He recommends many different practices, right? He mostly says, experiment, try on your own, see what works. But when people say, yeah, but what do you think? He'd say, well, try this or try that. And this is one he recommended over and over again. And there's two parts to it. The first part is centering your consciousness in your heart area. And the second part of it is focusing there on a feeling of aspiration or a feeling of bhakti, love, devotion, or surrender. And simply passively disregarding all other thoughts and feelings and riding that feeling deeper and deeper into the heart. Could we all take just a few minutes to try this on and just see what it's like? You can do this with eyes open or with eyes closed, either way. So first of all, simply center your consciousness in your heart area, as if you are physically located in your heart. And then from there, see if you can tune in to a feeling of aspiration or of love, of bhakti, surrender. For many people, these are too hard to connect to, but everybody can connect to aspiration because the soul is always aspiring. Again, there's a difference between aspiration and vital desire. Vital desire is unquiet, grasping, demanding. But aspiration is fundamentally peaceful. It's quiet. It can be intense, it can be strong, but it's fundamentally peaceful. So the soul is always aspiring for the divine, for its own emergence, for love, for bliss, for union. See if you can just find that feeling, or love, or bhakti, and just kind of ride that feeling deeper and deeper into the heart. Other feelings may arise, other thoughts. You may get spaced out. Again, just passively disregard these and gently remind yourself to come back to this place in your heart and to this feeling of aspiration, of love, because it's by the force of feeling that the heart opens, not through thought. It's through feeling. Sometimes what arises is how the heart is closed, in which case we may need to be with that for a while. And then when we can, ride this feeling of aspiration deeper and deeper within. Okay, and when you're ready, let's come back. Somewhere Sri Aurobindo says how before the consciousness rises above, in Integra Yoga, the natural center is the heart. The natural center to focus consciousness is the heart. And in doing that, as the heart opens, we need to also be careful that we don't get carried away in a vital display. It needs to be this inner heart, which is, again, fundamentally peaceful, fundamentally quiet, but which also has for us our real direction in life, if we can begin to listen to it more and more. So with that, let me bring this to a close. I think we're about at the 48 minute mark.
Thank you, Brent. It was wonderful. There are some questions here for you in the question and answer box. So first is Siegfried Bernal. When we talk about psychic being, do we talk in first person or in the third person? What relation does psychic being have with reincarnations, according to you?
Well, when we talk about the psychic being, it depends if we're referring to the psychic being as this entity, so therefore the third person more abstractly, or are we talking about it in relationship to ourselves? And am I actually in touch with the psychic being? Is it something I am speaking from experience? Or something I have had the experience of, but which is no longer there? Probably many of us have had the experience of it temporarily, but being permanently grounded in there or stabilized in that consciousness is something probably less common. So I think it just depends on the context, how we're talking about it. And the relation of the psychic being to reincarnation, I'm really going on Sri Aurobindo here. For Sri Aurobindo, the psychic being is what grows lifetime after lifetime. So at the end of a particular lifetime, as the different subtle bodies dissolve, the subtle physical, subtle emotional, subtle mental, the psychic being or the soul retires and extracts the spiritual essence of that lifetime and makes a soul growth from it. And then prepares for the next lifetime. What are the ways in which it wants to develop? And more psychic beings, as they develop, have a greater and greater say in the environment in which they are born, and a greater and greater sort of trajectory or direction that they are wanting to take. Initially, reincarnation is very rapid, according to Sri Aurobindo, almost automatic. But then as the psychic being develops, becomes more individuated, more differentiated, it takes greater care in consciously choosing the parents, the environment, and what it wants to develop in that lifetime.
Thank you. There is another question. How do you use the consciousness of the psychic being in your clinical practice?
Good question. Well, I think of our psychology as really, in some ways, organized around or centralized by the psychic being. But very, very few people are actually aware of it. And so my work as a therapist is to really work to help open the heart of somebody, to open the blockages of the surface heart. And as that occurs, the person becomes more and more able to listen to this deeper center within. For some people, that will open up spirituality. For some people, they will leave therapy at that point and simply go off on their journey. It all depends on the person. Many people who I see either already have a spiritual practice or find that their inner work helps their meditation in their practice. But I think of it as really psychotherapy as a process like clearing away this interference, this surface noise that prevents our deeper listening.
Thank you. There is another question: how to grow and open the heart and get the mind in control of?
Yeah, I mean, that is what sadhana is in integral yoga. How do we grow spiritually our soul? How do we open the heart? And how do we get our mind aligned with this? So Sri Aurobindo talks over and over how the spiritual life is very much trial and error, and very much a process of falling down, picking yourself up, dusting yourself off, going forward, falling down, picking yourself up, dusting yourself off, moving forward. It's very much trial and error. To listen to the psychic being, to listen to the deeper soul's guidance, requires real discernment, psychic discernment. And for Aurobindo, there is no quick and easy way to develop this. It develops progressively and slowly in most people, he says. But it takes aspiration. It takes focus. We have to really want to listen to it. Many of us have had the experience probably of having some big failure in life and then going, oh my God, if I'd really listened to myself, I wouldn't have done that. I wasn't really paying attention. I was just going on my vital desire and being carried away by that. Each time we do that, we go, oh yeah, I really wasn't paying attention. We begin to tune in to the voice of the psychic more fully. When we ignore its voice, when we're just lost in outwardness, that voice gets fainter and fainter. As we aspire to know it, as we turn within and pay attention to it, its voice gets stronger and stronger. The signal gets louder and louder. So it's simply a matter of practice and aspiration. That's my understanding of that process in integral yoga.
Thank you. There is a related question. Does the psychic being speak from the heart?
The psychic being speaks out of the heart. It speaks, but it also involves a much higher knowing than even the mind, right? Because the psychic, because the soul comes from the divine, because it comes from the truth, it knows the truth of all things. Can I read a paragraph from Sri Aurobindo where he describes this process?
Oh, please.
This is from The Life Divine. It's a paragraph. He says, as the crust of the outer nature cracks, as the walls of inner separation break down, the inner light gets through. The inner fire burns in the heart. The substance of the nature and the stuff of consciousness refined to a greater subtlety and purity, and the deeper psychic experiences, those which are not solely of an inner mental or an inner vital character, become possible in this subtler, purer, finer substance. the soul begins to unveil itself. The psychic personality reaches its full stature. The soul, the psychic entity, then manifests itself as the central being, which upholds mind and life and body and supports all the other powers and activities of the spirit. It takes up its greater function as the guide and rule of the nature. A guidance, a governance begins from within, which exposes every movement to the light of truth, repels what is false, obscure, opposed to the divine realization. Every region of the being, every nook and corner of it, every movement, formation, direction, inclination and thought, will, emotion, sensation, action, reaction, motive, disposition, desire, habit of the conscious or subconscious physical, even the most concealed, camouflaged, mute, recondite, is lighted up with the unerring psychic light, their confusions dissipated, their tangles disentangled, their obscurities, deceptions, self-deceptions, precisely indicated and removed. All is purified, set right, the whole nature harmonized, modulated in the psychic key, put in spiritual order. This process may be rapid or tardy, according to the amount of obscurity and resistance still left in the nature, but it goes on unfalteringly as long as it is not complete.
What is the page of this Live Divine quotation?
I have it on page 808, but that's an old hardbound copy. So
it's in the first chapter.
It's in the Triple Transformation.
Triple Transformation.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. That was one of the questions. And there are two related questions about artificial intelligence. Some say modern internet, tech, and artificial intelligence is a sign of evolution of consciousness of Sri Aurobindo. Others say AI has dumbed down intelligence. Your view?
My own view is that AI, artificial intelligence, is nothing more than a very fancy adding machine. AI, I mean, there's all this talk about, when AI becomes conscious. My own view is that that's silly because there's no soul there. There's no psychic being there, right? For true consciousness, there needs to be a psychic being. There needs to be a soul. And there isn't any in AI. And there never will be. So the psychic being, the soul, develops progressively out of nature over lifetimes. We can't transplant this into a computer. I just don't think it works that way. So a lot of the sci-fi stuff, although I enjoy sci-fi, I have a hard time sort of going along with. It's sort of making things sort of too human because it will never have this psychic being within.
It's simply instrumental. Our instrument could really take the position of the consciousness. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. And the last question, what is the relation between the egoic and psychic beings?
It depends on the person's evolution. At the beginning, there is not much connection. The psychic being exists in a wilderness, as Sri Aurobindo has said. Its directions go unheeded. Its guidance goes unheeded as the egoic outer nature simply runs the show. But over lifetimes, and then hopefully within this lifetime, as we do sadhana, there is an increasing relationship. This is what's called the psychic transformation, where there's the spiritual transformation where we go into the Atman and those energies come down to some degree. And there is the psychic transformation where the psychic being infuses this outer nature, refines this outer nature. And then the supramental is where the supramental comes down through the psychic and changes the physical. But the psychic transformation is essential. And that is what we are really talking about today. this process of increasing influence of the divine that becomes, or increasing influence of the psychic being that becomes more and more conscious the more we are on this path. The more we attend to this, the more we tune into this aspiration, the more we center in the heart, as that psychic being then awakens and then slowly comes forward more and more and more. That coming forward is a developing a relationship, is a psychicization of the ego. But we look at the current state of the world and we'd have to say there's not much relationship.
Right. There is also a very provocative, the last question from Irena from Auroville. It can be observed that many confuse the spiritual ego with the voice of psychic being. How to differentiate?
That is the $1 million question. If it was clear from the beginning, there would be no problem on the spiritual path. Sri Aurobindo says this is the cause of all the problems on the spiritual path. And this takes psychic discernment, which grows through trial and error, right? I think this is my psychic being. No, it's just my vital ego. Mm-hmm. Is this sense of unease my psychic being speaking, saying that's the wrong path? Or is it simply anxiety from my ego? And it's something I could really go beyond. What is actually happening? How do I really navigate these internal signals? How do I discern the difference between my egoic desire or repulsion from the psychic's inner guidance? Again, there is no clear answer to this other than trial and error. We need to find out for ourselves. But that is the question, and all of the sadhana depends on that. Yeah.
Right. So thank you very much. It was very clear and very delightful presentation on this very special and central topic in the yoga and sadhana. I hope we meet again and continue our journey and learning together from you, from your expertise, and this connection with psychology, with psychotherapy. For the first time, I saw it as possible in your presentation, as meaningful.
Oh, good.
Thank you. So if there are more announcements, Radha, please, then.
Sure, thanks, Vladimir, and thank you, Dr. Courtwright, so much. And just to let you know, we got several messages both in the chat and in the Q&A thanking you for your clarity and your sincerity and your wonderful talk. So this webinar, as well as all other previous New Perspectives webinars, are posted on our website, and I've put in the chat box the website URL, which is labrascenter.com. And just an announcement also that next week we will have Dr. Sumitra Basu will rejoin us, and he will speak on the overmental and supramental consciousness. And Dr. Yatsenko will provide an introduction to this topic. So we hope you can join us same time next Saturday. And thank you again, Dr. Courtwright.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Brent. Namaste.
My pleasure.